Morning. One walker beats 14 runners. That was one of my favorite bumper stickers years ago after we won our battle against the big government union bosses. You might remember at the time there were 14 state Senate Democrats in our state who fled the state and went to Illinois to help the special interest groups organize and then eventually ship in thousands of protesters from across the country. In fact, at one point, there were over 1,000 people occupying our state capitol. Maybe if you remember, the Occupy movement didn't start in Wall Street. It started on my street in Madison, Wisconsin. At the time, they didn't just limit themselves to our state capitol. They actually went to the executive residence, and eventually they found their way to our family home in Wauwatosa, which is more than an hour away from our state capitol. I had death threats. My wife, Tonette, had threatening messages. My sons, Matt and Alex, who were in high school at the time, literally were targeted on Facebook. They didn't limit it just to us. They went around events around the state. In fact, they disrupted and interrupted, I should say, the dedication of a new welcome center on our state line. They interrupted a ceremony for the 100-year celebration of one of our great state parks. They even interrupted the anniversary of one of our historic technical colleges. But the tipping point was probably more than anything was the day when a bunch of protesters, ironically enough, dressed as zombies. Don't ask me why, but that particular day they were the Walking Dead, I guess. They were zombies. They were protesters who showed up and interrupted. I should say it differently. They disrupted a law enforcement torch run for the Special Olympics. At that time, it was a turning point indeed, because the people in our state, no matter where they stood on the issues, could see that the protesters were not like them. I mean, who would mess up an event for Special Olympic athletes? It was just remarkable. But as I thought about that, thinking about speaking here today, I'm reminded of many of the stories I see these days around the country where protesters come en masse to try and disrupt public meetings, where angry mobs come to college campuses and try to stop people from speaking, where defenders of the status quo try to stop people who ran on an agenda from doing what they said they would do during the campaign. And as I hear these stories, I think to myself, been there, seen that. You know, from our standpoint, it's exactly why we've been talking not only here today, but to people over the last few months all across this great country, reminding our leaders about what happened in Wisconsin, about why we did what we did, and most importantly, about what's happened since. So let me share it with you a little bit here. In fact, I was reminded of late about that just 2 weeks ago, or tomorrow. So less than 2 weeks ago. It was 2 weeks ago tomorrow that I saw the video of protesters trying to stop the new U.S. Secretary of Education from going into a public school just up the way here in the District of Columbia. And so I called Betsy DeVos, who's a good friend of mine, and I said, you know what? Been there, done that. You remember in the midst of our protests, the protesters, as outrageous and radical as they were, they literally glued the door shut to an elementary school where I was going to come and read to the children. Now, the good news is that school was not to be deterred. They actually took the doors off the hinges, and we were able to read to the kids. But it was a vivid reminder about what we learned in Wisconsin. And that is to do what you said you were going to do. To go big, to go bold, to actually follow through on the promises you made throughout the campaign. You know, it's not only conservatives and Republicans who like that. What we found in Wisconsin is that independents and, yes, even some discerning Democrats like it when you do the things you say you were going to do. And so we've tried to apply that going forward. It's kind of interesting. It works on both political and on policy fronts. Politically, even though it's not just the fact that I've won 3 elections for governor, although I did. In our state, we not only won the 3 elections, but our Republicans in the legislature have actually gained seats in 12, in 14, and again in 16. Why? It's because common sense conservative reforms work. They actually work, and the people responded to them. In our state, we've seen over the last year more people were employed in my state than ever before, ever. We have the lowest unemployment rate since January of 2001. We have one of the highest percentages of people overall in the workforce. But beyond that, on economic and fiscal policy, we see that even though we inherited a $3.6 billion budget deficit, our state now has budget surpluses. And we have one of the few state systems that has a fully funded pension system. And we have one of the lowest outstanding overall long-term debt. And so now, because of those economic and fiscal reforms actually working, the successes have led to a positive budget. And in turn, we have what we call a reform dividend. Remember the peace dividend years ago under Reagan? We have a reform dividend. And so I want to spend just a couple minutes telling you about what we're doing with that. First off, we're reinvesting it like a good company would in the things that got us there in the first place. So top of the list, taxpayers. We're going to help lower the burden on the hardworking taxpayers. In fact, so much so with this budget, the total amount, cumulative impact of our tax relief over 8 years will be exceeded $8 billion. That's cutting taxes by over $8 billion. As we promised, property and income taxes will be lower in 2018 than they were in 2010. And you'll like this. We're actually eliminating an entire tax. For the first time since 1931, there will be no state tax on our property tax bills in Wisconsin. Beyond taxes, though, we're investing in our workforce. Probably like a lot of employers here, I hear from people all across my state that say, we've got jobs, we just don't have enough people to fill them. So we're investing in our workforce, and we're doing it in a way that demands better performance and more credibility and transparency from education and higher education. In fact, how many college students do we have here today? Let's see your hands and hear from you. Right? Okay, how many of those college students are from Wisconsin? Do I hear any of them? Okay, the Wisconsin students will appreciate this because we've frozen tuition in our state 4 years in a row, and in this budget, we're actually going to lower tuition by 5% at all of our campuses. Lower tuition, higher standards, and actual free speech for everyone, including conservative students, faculty, and speakers at all of our University of Wisconsin campuses. And the third big thing we're doing is about helping people transition from government dependence to true independence through work. You know, more than 20 years ago, my state, Wisconsin, led the way with welfare reform with a great leader by the name of Tommy Thompson. He was our governor back then. Today, we're taking it another giant step forward with something we call Wisconsin Works for Everyone. It's a simple concept. Everyone who is able to work has to be employed at least 80 hours a month if they want to get benefits like food stamps and housing vouchers. And for those that can't find work, we required them to be employed in job training. And now with a new president and a new Congress, we can actually go forward with our plan to ensure that everyone seeking welfare can actually pass a drug test. You see, it's simple. We want to help our fellow citizen, but we understand that public assistance should be a trampoline, not a hammock. We ensure that everyone who is able to work is empowered to work and required to work, because true freedom and prosperity don't come from the clumsy hand of the government. They come from empowering people to live their own lives and control their own destinies through the dignity that's born of work. And all those things show that conservative reforms work. But I just want to end with this. I want to make a challenge to each of you here today to keep moving forward. Don't stand still. Keep moving forward. 6 years ago, I remember a reporter asked us in the midst of all the protests in our capital, a reporter asked me, don't the protesters have a right to be heard? I said, absolutely. They absolutely have a right to be heard. This is America. Anybody can say or do what they want about the government. They can challenge the government no matter who's in power. But I then said to that same reporter that I wasn't going to let the noise of the protesters drown out the voices of the majority of people who had elected us to do the things that we were going to do. Sadly, in Washington, it is common practice to ignore the will of the voters. For too long, the media and the status quo defenders spend their time listening to the noise of the protest and the rhetoric of the pundits. That's why I call Washington 68 square miles surrounded by reality. My plea to you here today is to not get caught up in Washington, to not forget the voters, to not ignore the people who live in reality all across this country every single day. Don't forget them. Don't forget their families. Don't forget their neighbors. Fight for them. Fight for liberty. Fight for freedom. Fight for America. Let's keep it up. Thank you so much. God bless you. God bless this country. Have a great day.